Thank you, Pastor. What an introduction. Well, let's go back to the beginning, at least the beginning of my, what we now call Planet X. Spring of 2002, I had two individuals, a couple of friends of mine approach me. My friend Tom, who's a pilot and an aircraft mechanic. My friend Ron, who's a veteran of the peacetime army in Germany during the 1960s. Both these men are independent researchers, and they started telling me about Planet X and this book titled Blindsided by Mark Hazelwood. Mark did something that most authors won't do. He put evidence in the book that conflicts with his own value system. Most New Age authors, for example, won't have anything to do with the Bible, and most Bible scholars won't have anything to do with New Age information. But Mark Hazelwood included both, including historical evidence, archaeological evidence, fossilized evidence, geological, astronomical, biblical, psychic evidence, and last but not least, a lady who claims to talk to aliens. Now, that was a bit too much for me. However, I read the book, and I know documentation when I see it. I know evidence when I see it. Now, for a homicide detective, evidence is something you can put a blue evidence label on, mark it, and hand it to the court clerk as evidence. And much of what he had in the book is good evidence, well documented, that you can go back and find the original source material. So despite the lady who claimed to talk to aliens, who, by the way, gave her a date of the closest passage, that date being June of 2003, I continued my research, and I went deeper and deeper into the topic of Planet X. You heard in the introduction, I've been looking at Planet X-related matters since 1980. I began an independent research project in 1980, not knowing until 1992, 93, actually, what it was really all about. Going back to 1979, I found myself single, free weekends, looking for a hobby. I'd been out of the Army for 9 or 10 years, and I decided to go back in the Army Reserves as a Green Beret and let your tax dollars pay for my weekend fun. It seemed like a good deal to me. We spent a lot of our weekends in Special Forces training at a place called the Welding Springs Training Area, just west of St. Louis in St. Charles County. And along about 1980, the Department of Energy announced a Superfund cleanup project out there to clean up nuclear waste. Now, that was my first red flag because of the following. We guys in the Army knew that the military had been working with nuclear material out there for decades. So the men I worked with, on their own, without even telling the Army, they went to the trouble to get radiation detection equipment, and when we'd go out there training, they would routinely check out the training area to make sure there wasn't anything, because they didn't want to have kids with flippers instead of arms. It seemed like a good idea at the time. Point being, they never found any nuclear material. Barely anything above natural background radiation. Over the years, I watched this Department of Energy become a fairly good-sized project. They drug in the job trailers. They built about 15,000, 17,000 square feet of administrative buildings. Sometimes I would go by and photograph the names of the subcontractors at the front gate. At any government construction site, they always list the names of all the subcontractors at the front gate. One name happened to catch my eye one day, Worldwide Telecom. I didn't recognize that as a local business. So I submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to the Department of Energy, the contract specifications for Worldwide Telecom, along with 2 other requests for an engineering firm and a survey company. A few weeks later, I get a response back in the mail. The contract specs for the engineering company and the survey company, and a letter denying that Worldwide Telecom was even a subcontractor out there. And that kind of got my attention, so I went to a friend of mine who I thought might know who these people were. And he says, John, here's the deal. Now, this is in St. Louis. He says, so, first of all, they're headquartered in New Jersey. If you were going to build a brand new Pentagon, these are the people you would hire to put in the telecommunications. So that brought up even more questions. Under another Freedom of Information Act request, I asked how many phone lines they had out there at this construction site. The answer came back a couple of weeks later, 500 telephone lines. That sounded a bit large to me, so I talked to some contractor friends of mine, engineers who had spent 30 and 40 years in commercial construction, asking them what the largest number of phone lines they ever saw at the biggest construction site in their 40-year career of working commercial construction work, things like Boulder Dam and so forth. 50 phone lines at the largest construction site they ever saw in their 40-year career. Over the years, I interviewed different men who were working there, surveyors. I found out that everything was compartmentalized. They'd bring in one crew of surveyors to do a little section, another crew for over here from a different company, and a third and a fourth and so forth. Compartmentalized. I interviewed an engineer that worked out there This was just fairly recently. And she was telling me, she's an electrical engineer, she couldn't understand the level of confidentiality and secrecy at a no big deal construction site. How there were certain areas that were completely off limits unless you had a certain pass and a certain badge. I talked to a man who was working on concrete out there. He said, John, I never in my career put titanium flakes in concrete before. So all in all, what we came to find out, looking at the infrastructure, the communications, the power that was going in there and still going in there, the water, fresh water, sewage treatment, and so forth, all this being underground, is that they were building a command and control center where hundreds of men and women, and their families if necessary, could live, work, play, have microwave pizza, and watch movies for years if they needed to. A very large, self-contained complex. I knew that quite a long time ago, but I couldn't make the connection. It appeared to be very military on one hand, but it wasn't the military. So it was kind of a big question mark. What I did come to learn, however, is that Superfund cleanup projects amount to a bottomless pit of unaccountable money. There's very few people that understand the technology of cleaning up nuclear waste. Very few. And even less understand how much it costs or how long it takes. The attitude of the congressman appropriating the money is, how much money do you need? Do you need another 10 million? How long will it take? Take as long as it takes. We want this stuff out of here. No matter how much it costs or how much it takes, we will give you as much money as you need. That's the attitude of the public and Congress when it comes to cleaning up nuclear waste. And that's what they did out there, was spend millions and millions of dollars. We have any veterans of the U.S. Navy in here? Well, the military in general is a subculture of our American culture. And of course, the Navy is a subculture. However, there's another subculture, and that's the U.S. Navy Submarine Corps. Now, every man who's ever set foot in a submarine as a crew member, whether he's the lowest ranking, least experienced, newest guy on the ship, has the IQ to be an officer. It's a very select group of men. That's not done in very many units. Special Forces happens to be another one. I happen to know two men who served with the United States Submarine Corps. One of them since 1979. I was having lunch with him last summer. I was telling him about Planet X, and he's telling me about the Ross Ice Shelf, ROSS, the Ross Ice Shelf in the Antarctic. And he's telling me about a physics class, a classified physics class taught by a Navy officer over 20 years ago. The Navy officer is now an admiral. What the U.S. Navy was telling the Submarine Corps more than 20 years ago is what will happen when the Ross Ice Shelf and the rest of the ice at the Antarctic melts, that the ocean levels will rise 14 to 32 feet. And it won't be like a bathtub filling with water. There'll be violent storms accompanying the rising ocean levels. I was telling him about Planet X, as I mentioned, and it wasn't until the next day that I realized we were both talking about the same thing. That he was talking about an effect, and I was talking about a cause. There has to be a trigger to cause this ice to melt. And I believe now we know what that trigger is. More recently, I recalled a map that a patient of my wife had showed me, going back 14 years or so. My wife, a chiropractor, has a lot of patients. One of them brought in this map that was prepared by Gordon Michael Scallion, a map that was alleged to be what North America looks like after these waters come up and land has raised and land has sunk beneath the ocean. At the time, I looked at this map and I thought to myself, this is a very nice, full-color fantasy, and this lady needs a tinfoil hat real bad. That was my thought. I didn't have anything else to correlate it to. More recently, however, I remembered this map, and I looked it up on the internet, a small version, about 4 by 5 inches, and I emailed it to my friend in the Submarine Corps. However, I remembered this map, and I looked it up on the internet, a small version, about 4 by 5 inches, and I emailed it to my friend in the Submarine Corps. He emails me back, and he says, John, it's pretty accurate. It's just about exactly what the Navy told us this is going to look like, except most of Wisconsin's gone, according to the Navy, and it's not on this map. Now, this map shows large portions of the United States being underwater. Parts of the East Coast, about half of Florida, most of Louisiana, an inland sea, according to both the Navy and my friend, stretching from the Great Lakes to Hudson Bay, uninterrupted. Mississippi River, coming up from what used to be New Orleans, almost up to Memphis, 5 to 10 times wider than it is now. A couple of months ago, I was a lecturer at a college class, along with another gentleman who spent 20 years in military intelligence with the Air Force. This gentleman did a 3-year tour of duty with the Submarine Corps. Well, dinner afterwards, and I bring up the topic of the Ross Ice Shelf. His wife's sitting next to me, and he starts telling me about what he knew about the Ross Ice Shelf, basically parallel to what my friend told me a few months previously. Then his wife pipes up and says, well, when it came time to retire, the gentleman was working in the Pentagon. They could move anywhere in the United States. They'd been a military family for 20 years and were used to living all over and had friends literally all over the country. When it came time to pick their retirement home, they specifically picked the Missouri, Arkansas Ozarks because of the altitude and because of what the U.S. Navy told them about rising waters. My friend also, that I had lunch with last year, he also picked the Arkansas Ozarks because of what the U.S. Navy told him in classified briefings about rising water. Being on the road the past week, I've bumped into a number of people who know the zip codes just because they sell insurance, for example. A lot of records are kept by zip codes. And there is a noticeable increase of military retirees living in the zip codes that comprise the Missouri, Arkansas Ozarks, especially Navy veterans. For those who need a little more evidence they can get their arms around, the Pentagon issued a report in October 2003. I need to read this to you because you can't possibly memorize something as convoluted as this. It's titled, An Abrupt Climate Change Scenario and Its Implications for United States National Security, October 2003, commissioned by the United States Defense Department, authored by Mr. Schwartz and Mr. Randall. What these authors say in this report is that global warming should be taken out of the area of being kind of a routine scientific debate and put in the area of a clear and present national security matter. That abrupt climate change may occur in the not-too-distant future. Not decades in the future, in the not-too-distant future, causing longer, harsher winters in America, massive droughts turning farmland into dust bowls, and forest. Now you may say to yourself, John, it sounds like you're talking about global warming. You might recall that global warming became an issue about 1985. Now by 1985, the government knew full well what would be happening 20 years later. They knew the events that would be occurring and why they would be occurring. And they knew they needed a cover story to keep everybody calm and peaceful, going to work every morning, paying their mortgage, and being good little citizens. So the cover story they decided on was global warming. And it's been very effective. And here's the way I break it down. These percentages, or my percentages, are not from any scientific study or anything, but I've chosen these as representative of what I feel has been going on here for a while. About 49.5% of the population believes global warming is a clear and present danger, putting the earth at risk, putting animals and plant life at risk, and human beings at risk of harm. And that is caused by that knucklehead next door in his SUV, human activity. That's about 49.5% of the adults. Another 49.5% of the adults believe one of the two things. Either that global warming isn't happening at all and isn't real, or that it's kind of a naturally occurring, slow-moving event, and it won't do any harm, and there's nothing we can do about it anyway. That's the other 49%. That leaves 1%, ladies and gentlemen. That's you in the audience. That's you folks watching this tape. The 1% who actually get their news someplace other than television news, who take the time to actually read books and look for alternative news on the internet or on shortwave radio. That's 1% or less of the adults in this country. Maybe 1.5%, because according to the American Library Association, 3% of the adults in this country have a library card, and half of them use their library card for light entertainment reading, leaving about 1.5% that both have a library card and use it for something other than light entertainment reading. The deception continues. I have a current issue of The Economist magazine published in London, and they have an article, not an interview, but an article written by the Prime Minister of England, Mr. Tony Blair. You might imagine that if you're the Prime Minister of England and you're writing an article that's going to be published in the most respected magazines on the planet, it's going to be edited, and reviewed for content, for legality, for scientific accuracy, and of course for grammar. This temperature rise has meant a rise in sea levels. Current tense. One is talking about sea levels rising right now, because they are rising right now. If it continues as predicted, it will mean hundreds of millions of people increasingly at risk from flooding, and climate change means more than warmer weather. It means extreme, increasingly unpredictable weather events, rainstorms, droughts, heavy human and economic cost. Now, of course, this was written prior to many of the events that we're now aware of happening. The lead time typically for a magazine like this is several months. Here's what's going on with the weather right now. You may not be aware of. This has never happened, ladies and gentlemen. It is surviving the winter and coming up the next spring and growing even more. This has never happened anyplace. At the same time we're having snowfall in Las Vegas, they're canceling dog sled runs and contests in Alaska because they don't have enough snow. Things are getting very, very bizarre. Global warming issue has been very effective in keeping people in the dark as to exactly what's been going on. Got a few Bible quotes here for you folks. Joshua 10:13 talks about the sun standing still. Now up until fairly recently, and I mean within the last 55, 60 years since about 1950, how the sun could possibly stand still. Bible scholars referred to Joshua 10:13 as a metaphor. Typically, Bible scholars do that. If they don't understand this stuff, they say, well, it's a metaphor. It really means something else. Well, about 1950 or so, the concept of a pole shift became apparent to scientists, and they understood how the Hebrews in the Sinai desert could look up and see the sun not moving. For the 19th century before that, they couldn't. If you were standing at the right place on the planet and the pole was to shift, the sun would have the appearance of standing still in the sky. Another researcher, about the same time, Dr. Velikovsky, Emmanuel Velikovsky, nobody had done previously. He did research comparing what the men studying the ancient Chinese had written and the men studying the ancient Mayans had written. People who live in Scandinavia, ancient folks had written, both of whom had, all those ancient cultures had written records and calendars. Velikovsky reasoned that if the Hebrews standing in the Sinai desert saw the sun standing still, then the Chinese must have saw it not come up the next morning when it was supposed to. Keeping in mind the Chinese had written records and had calendars, and you could line up the Hebrew calendar and the Chinese calendar to compare them if you knew what you were doing. And guess what, ladies and gentlemen? On that date in history, when the Hebrews in the Sinai desert saw the sun stand still, the Chinese saw the sun not come up. The Bible means what it says, and it's 100% accurate. Exodus 16:31. Now this all happened shortly after Moses made his exodus. The Hebrews in the Sinai desert would wake up every morning and they would find substance of a certain color, of a certain substance, and a certain taste lying on the ground that they could pick up and eat. As it turns out, other cultures who had written records and calendars all left written records attached to the same dates, where every morning they could go out and pick up a substance of the same color and the same consistency and the same taste and eat it in China, in South America, and in Scandinavia. What we believe manna from heaven was carbohydrates in the atmosphere that would condense when the sun hit it. It would fall to ground, and you could pick up and eat it. Once again, the Bible being verified by other written records all over the planet of that same substance being there. Isaiah 24:1. Behold, the Lord maketh the earth empty, and maketh it waste, and turneth it upside down, and scatter abroad the inhabitants thereof. That sounds like a global earthquake to me. That sounds like a very good description of a global earthquake. Isaiah 24:20. The earth shall reel to and fro like a drunkard, and shall be removed like a cottage. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, what appears to be an excellent description of a very large global earthquake. Right there in the Bible, waiting for you to read it and look at it yourself. When I first heard this story about Planet X, and I read Hazelwood's book, one of the first things I did was approach a friend of mine who has privileged access to certain government agencies. And I said, can you check this out? I'd appreciate it. He said, I never heard of it, but I'll check it out. He got back with me a couple of weeks later, and he says, John, it's a real thing. They've been watching this thing for more than 20 years. It's out there. They got the Hubble watching it. They got all this instrumentation keeping track of it. It's got a 250,000-mile debris field on either side of it. When I say a debris field, I mean rocks the size of pickup trucks and rocks the size of Rhode Island. Big rocks and little rocks. It's traveling in a cloud of red dust, which means when we finally are able to see it, it'll probably duplicate what was seen by ancient peoples as being a red cross in the sky. The red dust will refract the light and make it appear to be a red cross in the sky. Both my private sources and NASA that Planet X is 3 to 5 Earth masses large.
And Moon and the Stars.
About 1979, they sent the Pioneer space probe looking for this thing, and here's why. Astronomy uses a lot of instrumentation. They use telescopes in the visible light spectrum, telescopes in the infrared light spectrum, telescopes in the ultraviolet light spectrum, and radio telescopes. They take all this imaging, and this is where astronomy gets down to what's really important, that's mathematics. They use mathematics to determine how big these objects are, how far away they are, how fast they're traveling, how far apart they are from each other. Pioneer space probe determined all those things, and they've been watching it very carefully. They've determined that this object is on an elliptical orbit. That means it goes way out. When I say way out, It takes 1,800 years to go out and 1,800 years to come back that we're used to, Neptune, Saturn, and so forth. They make more or less a circular orbit. Some of them tend to be a bit elliptical, but pretty much circular. This planet has been the object of a lot of government building shelters like what I described all over the United States. And they are, in fact, shelters for high-ranking government officials, immediate families, including their adult children. And all of us have heard about the great earthquake of December 26 and the tidal wave tsunami that followed. Most of us know that it was supposed to be the greatest earthquake since the Prince William Sound earthquake in 1964 off the coast of Alaska. But we hear these numbers about the Richter scale. And a lot of people don't understand what the Richter scale is, and I'll try to explain it in terms that you can all understand. I was in front of an audience in Detroit the other night, and I first asked if there were any self-employed people in the audience. We had several, and I picked one out, and I said, "Sir, I will offer to work for you for 40 hours. You only need to pay me for 30, and my wages for my first hour will be 1 penny, and my wages for the second hour will be 2 pennies. My third hour will be 4 pennies, and if you will agree to double my wages until I get to 30 hours, I'll work that extra 10 hours for free." By the time you're to 30 hours, ladies and gentlemen, doubling that penny, you're about $4 million. It's a logarithmic scale. The Richter scale is a logarithmic scale. Every 1/10 of a point, starting at point 1, doubles the power, doubles the intensity. So when you go from 5 to 6, for example, you've got 1,000% more power. 5.1, 5.2, and so forth. What happened on December 26 literally shook the planet. Some scientists made the reference that it rang the earth like a bell. There's been some speculation that it may have been man-caused. However, it was predicted by at least 2 sets of scientists I know of. Some Indian scientists predicted the earthquake several days before it happened based on a modality involving planetary alignment. And a gentleman named Stan Deyo predicted the earthquake on December 23rd based on his observation of ocean temperatures. Now, anybody can do this. There are sensing devices in the oceans all over the planet. They feed into satellites. They feed into the internet. You can sit in the comfort of your home and do this any place you have internet access. He saw something in his 9 years of research he had never seen. He saw all along that 600-mile fault drastically increasing temperatures on one side of the fault, drastically decreasing temperatures on the other. It is denser and therefore more heavy. When he saw that temperature difference along that fault, that's when he issued his warning, because he knew that was probably going to trigger an earthquake. And of course, it did. I need to explain a little bit more about what Planet X is. We've kind of been dancing around the topic here a little bit. Every 3,600 years, which has both the characteristics of a planet and the characteristics of a comet, comes through our solar system. It's well documented in the Bible, fairly well documented around the time of Moses' exodus out of Egypt. The following things, all of them can happen, or some of them. Global warming, melting polar ice, rising ocean levels, possibly a pole shift, drastic climate changes, storms with torrential rains, 200-mile-an-hour winds, meteor strikes, volcanoes, earthquakes, tidal waves, land masses rising from the ocean, land masses sinking from the ocean. And I'm going to go over some of these things in detail. Power grids being shut down, satellite communication disruptions. We know that because of the solar activity. Now, to a certain extent, we're already seeing most of these things already happening. There's little doubt that global warming is now taking place. I think even the strongest doubting Thomases now believe that is the case. I was reading in the Smithsonian Magazine recently about a small island nation that is losing a lot of square feet almost every day due to rising ocean levels. Meteor strikes. Apparently there's been a lot more of them through history than we were ever aware of. I'm a Missouri resident, and I managed to live 55 years without knowing we had a 12-mile diameter meteor crater in Missouri, which just happens to line up with a whole string of meteor craters. If you start at the meteor crater in Arizona, that's the old Route 66 tourist attraction, and connect the dots, connect the meteor craters, they string all the way across the United States. Fairly large meteor craters. There's always several dozen volcanoes going off on this planet at any given time. That's pretty much the way things have always been. It appears, though, that we have more volcanoes at the same time with more severity now than we've ever had at the same time. It wasn't so long ago, a couple of years ago, when if there was a foot of rain, it was major news. It was really major news. Now it's become almost routine. 12 inches of rain has become something that still makes the news, but hardly like it did before. On my speaking tour, I was up in parts of the Northeast, especially Detroit, where the largest power outage in the history of this country knocked out power. The government's explanations got to the point where nobody was trusting or believing what they said. First they said it was Canada was the reason. Canada let us know real quick that they weren't the reason. Then they said it was a squirrel. Then they said it was a stick. Then they said something happened in a power plant in Ohio. And I don't think we still know to this day exactly why the power went out to all those millions of people. We do know, however, solar activity, solar flares, can knock out power grids. That's well documented that they can do that. We need to talk a little bit about Alaska. I was just reading a New York Times article. It's been published several years ago, back in 2002. And the details, as they say, is where the devil is. The details are in the devil. The engineers that are in charge of maintaining the Trans-Alaska pipeline, 800 miles long, they're having to do a lot more work these days, and I'll explain why. There's a term that the Alaskans are using now called referring to the trees up there frequently as the drunken trees. As the permafrost is melting, the roots of these trees go down to the permafrost and they stop. Now with the permafrost melting, the trees are toppling over, and the natives are calling them the drunken trees. Which brings us to the Alaskan pipeline and the entire man-made infrastructure in Alaska. Every man-made structure in Alaska, whether it's the pipeline or buildings, telephone poles, were all built with the underlying engineering principle that the permafrost would always be, as the name implies, permanently frozen. Now that the permafrost is melting, the entire man-made infrastructure up there is at risk. People are having to buy jacks to put under their house because the foundations of their homes are collapsing. Roads are becoming like Six Flags rides. The pipeline has to have continuous surveillance and re-engineering and new concrete being poured and piers being put down to where it finally is solid because the entire Alaskan pipeline was built on top of the permafrost. That's what engineers knew, that's what they were told, and they had no reason to believe otherwise, that the permafrost would be anything other than permanently frozen. Rising ocean levels. So what's the big deal, John? Here's the big deal. 80% of the people on this planet live within 100 miles of an ocean. The closer you get to the water, the denser the population. Some areas you can go for miles and miles and miles from the water and still not be very many feet above sea level. Pastor mentioned in his introduction, parts of Florida are 55 feet above sea level. Most of Florida isn't. The part above sea level, 55 feet, is not very much of Florida. What's at risk when the ocean levels rise is the infrastructure that has the port facilities for ocean-going ships, the ships that move the bulk loads of corn and wheat and soybeans, the ships that move the bulk petroleum products and the coal and the lumber and the iron ore, all the things that modern society needs to function. The port facilities are at risk of being damaged or destroyed. The infrastructure that supports all these people, the potable water facilities, making fresh water, telecommunications, the power grid, natural gas, the roads, all that infrastructure is at risk of being damaged or destroyed if and when the ocean levels rise. I mentioned the Ross Ice Shelf a few minutes ago. There used to be a couple of other ice shelves out there. Larsen A, that's L-A-R-S-E-N, A as in Alpha, L-A-R-S-E-N-B as in Bravo. I know a lot of people watching this tape have seen the Hollywood movie, The Day After Tomorrow. The opening scene in The Day After Tomorrow, they've got an American flag at this Antarctic research center. I had to watch the movie the second time before I saw this. There's a subtitle superimposed on the flag, and I didn't catch it because it was only flashed for about 8 seconds. It said Larsen B Ice Shelf, superimposed on the American flag. The opening scene is the Larsen B Ice Shelf breaking away from the Antarctic continent and drifting off into the ocean. That really did happen, ladies and gentlemen. That's real science. And up until a few days ago, when an even larger iceberg broke off, the largest ice shelf ever to break away. It, of course, was attached to the Ross Ice Shelf. The Ross Ice Shelf is about 265,000 square miles. That's about the size of Texas. It rises above the ocean 600 to 3,000 feet. The Antarctic continent, ladies and gentlemen, has approximately 70% of all the fresh water on planet Earth locked up in ice. Thousands of feet thick. And it is melting, and it's melting from underneath. Ladies and gentlemen, I already explained what the is, and that's to build shelters to take care of their own people. These shelters have been built all over the country. However, there's more to that you don't know. Apparently, the United States Navy has built undersea cities. My friend told me about this last August while we were having lunch. And then while I was having dinner with this other veteran of the submarine corps, this intelligence officer, I brought up the topic, and I'm talking to my friend, the college professor sitting next to him, about these undersea bases, undersea cities where hundreds of men and women can live and work and be comfortable. Well, the former intelligence officer is just kind of eating his pasta and keeping quiet, and finally he looks up and he says, you know, let's move on to a different topic, however, and that would be now when I first heard about this, I didn't make the connection. And when I found out about this second piece of information, everything else fell into place. There's something called the Vatican Observatory Research Group, and they operate something called the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope. Now that's a mouthful. Located at Mount Graham International Observatory in southeastern Arizona. I spent most of my life thinking the Catholic Church was involved in saving souls, running Mother Teresa, helping the people over there in India, that kind of thing. It never occurred to me that the Vatican would be so interested in astronomy that they would go to the time and the expense of building and manning a professional. It's sort of like the Marine Corps selling used cars. I mean, it just doesn't fit. It's not part of their mission statement. But we need to remember, ladies and gentlemen, that the Vatican is a foreign government. They have their own postage stamps. They have their own bank. They have a defined territory that's their country. And without a doubt, the Vatican has an intelligence service, and they have vaults full of documents going back for nearly 20 centuries, at least 17 centuries, full of documents from all over the planet that they've acquired. Back in 1999, an engineer friend of mine, radio frequency engineer, was retained by the Sisters of St. Agnes in St. Louis. Now, this is a Catholic order, and for several $1,000s a month, you will be well cared for. It's a very nice place. My friend, the RF engineer, radio frequency engineer, this is the kind of guy that you could hire to come in and set up a 50,000-watt commercial radio station. He really knows his stuff. The contract with the Sisters of St. Agnes was to two-way radio communications at this facility in St. Louis to talk to the Vatican in Rome halfway around the planet. Now, we're not talking, ladies and gentlemen, about 10-4 Good Buddy CB equipment here. We're talking professional-grade military communications equipment that is for serious people that want to do serious communications. Now, of course, you would have to have the exact, or they couldn't talk back and forth. At the same time, he found out that Sisters of St. Agnes purchased real estate in the Missouri Ozarks, built a building out there with food. Point being, ladies and gentlemen, the Vatican Church, like any large organization, will attempt to take care of their own people to the best of their ability. That's just the way big organizations work. It doesn't matter whether it's the U.S. government, IBM, or the Vatican. All large organizations want to care for their people to the best of their ability. And to my satisfaction, that is the Vatican's. At the time we thought, keep in mind this was 1999, we thought this was Y2K related. Nothing else made sense. But now, putting two and two together, we're getting four. You put the Vatican, all this equipment for communications, and spending the money to set up a professional observatory in Arizona. And of course, what do you have? You have preparations for Planet X. Nothing else. In passing, I've mentioned a pole shift several times. A pole shift is when the North Pole, from someplace, we don't know for sure how many pole shifts there's been, possibly as many as 150. A typical pole shift is about 20 degrees, which may not sound like a whole lot, seeing as how 180 degrees would be a complete flip-flop. What does 20 degrees mean? Well, if you're at the equator, 20 degrees doesn't mean a whole lot. You're not going to notice a big difference if you're at the equator. If you're in Maine and you get a 20-degree pole shift, you could get the climate of Atlanta, Georgia. So the farther north you get, the more drastic a small change can make. Going back to the film, The Day After Tomorrow, there was some science in there, as well as the Hollywood special effects and sensationalism and bad science. The three youngsters in that film are in a museum, and one of the displays is a stuffed mastodon. Now, most people know that mastodons have been found frozen in Siberia. That's fairly common knowledge. Here's some things you may not know, however. People in the audience who are farmers and hunters, they'll know what I'm about to say. When a mammal dies, it could be a cow or a deer, it doesn't matter. When a mammal dies, the first thing to deteriorate is the eyeball. Within hours, especially if it's warm, insects will attack that eyeball and it will start to deteriorate. And by the end of the day, the deterioration will be well underway. The mastodons found frozen in Siberia, the eyeballs were not deteriorated. The mastodons were flash frozen so quickly that the meat was still fresh enough that it was being harvested and sold for human consumption in Russian markets. It wasn't just 2 or 3 mastodons, it was hundreds of mastodons found frozen in a similar fashion. The mastodons were standing there one moment, calmly eating a subtropical plant. They're flash frozen for thousands of years. flash frozen so quickly that the meat never had time to deteriorate, even after all those years. What caused that to happen? A pole shift can happen in a matter of hours. I'm going to get into a rather dramatic explanation of what a pole shift would make happen on this planet towards the end of this presentation. But now it's time for some scientific evidence. People love individuals with credentials. We like to see guys with white lab coats and all these letters behind their name. That gives credibility. In the area of astronomy, about the highest credentials you could ever hope to have would be to become the supervising astronomer for the United States Naval Observatory. I became aware of an interview with that very man back in 1990, Dr. Robert Harrington, who at the time he was interviewed, and the interview was tape recorded, of course, videotaped, August 30th, 1990, at the time of the interview, in his office at the United States Naval Observatory, he was the supervising astronomer. Now, there's lots of astronomers. In fact, there's children that got telescopes and look at stars. And there's high school teachers that got telescopes and look at stars. Lots of amateur astronomers that have some ability and some knowledge. Your local paramedic knows how to stop bleeding is one level of expertise. The man who teaches heart transplants at Harvard University is another level of expertise when it comes to stopping bleeding. Both men know how to stop bleeding, but drastically different credentials. When it comes to the astronomy, had the best credentials in that career that you could ever want to have. The interview was recorded and is on a DVD titled Are We Alone in the Universe? Most of the DVD, Zecharia Sitchin. Now, Sitchin's kind of an unusual guy in himself. You can take one look at Zecharia Sitchin and you say, there's a guy that spent 40 years in a library. He can pick up Sumerian clay tablets and read them like the newspaper. I mean, what a guy. But these last 15 minutes, when he's interviewing Dr. Harrington, are very, very revealing. I'm going to have some quotes here from Dr. Harrington. We've been looking for this thing, the 10th planet, for 12 years, since 1978. We predicted the existence of the 10th planet in 1978. Now, ladies and gentlemen, when the supervising astronomer for the United States Naval Observatory tells you there's a 10th planet, I think you better well be paying attention. Quote Dr. Harrington, if it turns out to be on a 3,600-year orbit, he didn't know the length or the exact structure of the orbit at that time. Professor Harrington again, he believes it has a mass, quote-unquote, a mass of 3 to 5 times the mass of Earth. Dr. Harrington again, perfectly capable of supporting life forms of one kind or another. Dr. Harrington goes on to show a diagram of what he believes to be the elliptical orbit of Planet X. Not long after this interview in 1990, Dr. Harrington announced that he was going to pack up his telescope and go to the Antarctic and look for Planet X. Not long after that, it was announced that he had a fast-acting form of cancer, and he was dead in about 90 days. March 1992 press release from NASA. Unexplained deviations in the orbits of Uranus and Neptune point to a large outer solar system body, 4 to 8 Earth masses on a highly tilted orbit beyond 7 billion miles from the Sun. They went looking for this thing, and they found it. They used their mathematical calculations to determine where this object should be out there, and they sent the Pioneer space probe looking for it, and they found it. Now, NASA's been playing games with us, ladies and gentlemen, for a lot of years here. Sometimes NASA is referred to as never a straight answer, and I think with good reason. I mentioned Dr. Velikovsky a couple of times. Dr. Velikovsky was a medical doctor. He's been deceased for quite a while, probably more than 20 years. He started writing his books about 1950, Earth in Upheaval. I have here in front of me a photocopy of one page of one book. Now, what this one page does is summarize hundreds and hundreds of reports and facts and figures of what happens during a pole shift, based on real research by real scientists, based on digging up evidence that demonstrates what happens during a pole shift. This one page but it paints a very good word picture as to what would happen. Let us assume, as a working hypothesis, that under the impact of a force or the influence of an agent, and the Earth does not travel in an empty universe, the axis of the Earth shifted or tilted. At that, air and water would continue to move through inertia, hurricanes would sweep the Earth, and the seas would rush over continents, carrying gravel and sand and marine animals and casting them on the land. Heat would be developed, rocks would melt, volcanoes would erupt, lava would flow from fissures in the erupted ground and cover vast. It would spring up from the plains and would travel and climb on the shoulders of other mountains, causing rifts and faults. Lakes would be tilted and emptied. Rivers would change their beds. large land areas with all their inhabitants would slip under the sea. Forests would burn, and hurricanes and wild seas would wrest them from the ground on which they grew and pile them branch and root in huge heaps. Seas would turn into deserts, their waters rolling away. If a change in the velocity of the rotation, slowing it down, should accompany the shifting of the axis, the water confined to the equatorial oceans by centrifugal force would retreat to the poles, and high tides and hurricanes would rush from pole to pole, carrying reindeer and seals to the tropics, and desert lions into the Arctic, moving from the equator to the mountain ridges of the Himalayas, and down the African jungles, and crumpled rocks torn from splintering mountains would be scattered over large distances, and herds of animals would be washed from the plains of Siberia. The shifting of the axis would also change the climate of every place, leaving corals in Newfoundland, elephants in Alaska, fig trees in northern Greenland, and luxuriant forests in Antarctica. In the event of a rapid shift of the axis, many species and genera of animals on land and in the sea would be destroyed, and civilizations would be reduced to ruins. Now, 50 years ago, there was a lot of speculation in here as far as the average person was concerned. Civilization slipping into the sea. You know, ladies and gentlemen, since World War II, new sport of scuba diving, which didn't exist prior to World War II, we have imaging techniques to look through the oceans and see what's down there. Just fairly recently, a city was found stretching between the island of Okinawa and the main islands of Japan. We have very large stone buildings. I've seen photographs of some of these buildings with scuba divers next to them. The scuba divers look like little toy soldiers compared to these large stone buildings. Stone buildings have been found under the sea in the Caribbean. The ancient city of Alexandria, Egypt, has been found just off the coast of Egypt in the Mediterranean. And the list goes on and on and on of man-made structures being found under the ocean all over the planet. The bones of animals have been found in caves to their final resting place, but apparently crushed and jumbled together under a huge force, most likely water, crushed and jumbled together. You dig down through the permafrost in Alaska that I mentioned earlier, and you do, in fact, find tropical plants. Christopher Columbus, it's been known, had maps when he went on his journey to find the New World, had maps showing the Antarctic continent. Now, it wasn't until after World War II that we had the imaging technology to see through the ice and tell where the land stopped and the ocean began. Once we had that imaging technology, scientists could prove the accuracy of the maps that Christopher Columbus had in his possession, maps which were made from much older maps. In fact, similar maps were found on dusty shelves in Constantinople. To understand this issue, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to have to do your own homework. The best living scientist that I know on this topic is Professor James McCanney, MS. The two books I most recommend are Planet X, Comets and Earth Changes, and Surviving Planet X Passage. I highly recommend, in addition, Atlantis to Tesla and Principia Meteorologica, that's a mouthful, The Physics of Sun-Earth Weather. I recommend some other books, but those are the main ones. Weather people have been telling you on radio and TV about the weather is only half the truth. What they'll tell you is that all weather on planet Earth is caused by the sun. What they'll tell you is the sun has become a lot more active, and that is true. What they won't tell you, however, is the reason the sun is becoming more active. There's a vast new source of energy interacting with our sun and causing it to become more active. It's been known for a number of decades. Our sun goes through an 11-year cycle of increasing solar activity to a high point for 11 years and then decreasing solar activity for 11 years to a low point about 3 years ago. 3 years ago in this case. And solar activity continues to get higher and higher levels of M-class flares and X-class flares, sunspots, all the things which create the weather that we have on planet Earth. So you would be well advised, all of you out there watching this tape, to do your own homework and come to understand what these issues really are and why our weather is doing what it is doing. One of the things that happened to me when I started researching this will happen to most of you if you don't get this warning first, and that's to not go down the rabbit trail of looking for a date. I'm pretty convinced at this point that a date doesn't matter. A particular month doesn't matter. It becomes clear pretty quickly that the two most dangerous points are the closest passage going past Earth into the solar system, past us, behind the sun, and then once again when it comes back out on the other side of the sun. These events have been going on. When I say these events, Earth changes events involving bizarre weather events have been going on now for well more than 2 years, and I fully expect them to go on for several more years. How many more years, I can't say. There will be times when it gets a lot more violent, and there will be times of a bit more peace, I believe. Some people believe that haven't looked at this very carefully, that Planet X may hit the Earth. No, that won't happen. It hasn't happened yet. It's been swinging through every 3,600 years. For the odds of us hitting us are remote, and if it did, we all go to meet Jesus, and that's the end of that, and nothing to worry about. A member of the audience wants to know, how long will it be before millions begin to die? What happened on December 26th, the beginning point of that, I've seen numbers ranging from 250,000 to 500,000 dead right now. Some of these areas are so remote that when a rescue helicopter went to land on one of these islands, it was attacked by natives with bows and arrows. They aren't used to seeing anybody from the outside world. The countries where these people live did not know how many people lived there before, so how could they possibly know how many people were there after the tsunami or could have been killed? A member of the audience wants to know, will we ever be able to see Planet X? The answer is yes, to the best of my knowledge, we will. Up from the south now, if you say this is the sun, all our planets go around more or less on a flat plane. This planet comes up from the south, from our south pole, goes behind our sun, comes back down. For quite a period of time, you'll be able to see Planet X, probably from your own backyard without any instruments of any kind. Something as large as 3 to 5 times the mass of Earth is something you can't hide. So, ladies and gentlemen, just to recap this portion of it real quick, don't go looking for a date. Don't get too worried about.
All right, let's turn to Luke 21:25. I want to show you some things that I believe God has shown me in the Scriptures regarding the end times. And let me just clarify. Based upon the information that John has shown us here, we're going to continue to see more really strange things with the weather. Continue to see the earth begin to fall apart. Because I do not believe God is destroying the earth. I believe the earth is already messed up from the way it was before the fall. And I think God is just restoring all things. I know that the Bible says there's going to be a time when there will be no more sea. I want you to think about this, that we can't even begin to understand how God can do these kind of things. We don't understand, but He has a way, a higher way, a better way, and it's good. It's not bad news. It's nothing to be afraid of. And when everything in the sea dies, that everything, there'll be no more sea. And it says you'll be able to walk across the Euphrates with your sandals on and not get your feet wet. And it says every high place is going to fall. Every valley or every low place is going to raise up. There'll be no more sea. In other words, the earth is going to be a perfect ball. I believe it's going to be better than it ever was in the Garden of Eden. It's going to be like a Garden of Eden all the way around the earth. It's going to be perfect once again. As I was starting to say, I don't think that we can say conclusively that there is a Planet X. I can possibly see of. Stan, are you saying you believe in Planet X? But I know this, something like, but I can say this is going to happen. I can say it's going to be bad for the sinners, and it's going to be good for the kingdom of God. I can say that God is going to supernaturally gather and protect His own in this time of trouble. And the reason He's sending it, if our heart is after this world and the things of this world, then we're not going to like the things that we're going to see. But if our heart is after righteousness, if our heart is after the kingdom of God, if our heart is after souls, understand as we go through this, protect us. I want to say that again. God is going to protect us as we go through these times. It's not going to be as bad as some people think. It's going to be worse. That our God knows how to deliver sinners, and He knows how to deliver the righteous out of the hands of the sinners. He knows how, because we're not appointed to wrath. Okay, now with that in mind, Luke 21:25. And it says, and there shall be signs in the sun. I want you to look at these 4 things. I want you to remember this thing. The most talked about events in all of Bible prophecy. 4 things. The sun, the moon, the stars, and the heavens, or the constellations. 4 things. You'll notice this all through the talk. I also want you to notice the word clouds. Everyone say the word clouds, okay? I want you to notice as we go through this, the clouds, because Jesus is associated. All through this, you're going to notice the sun. And notice as we go through this, the clouds, because Jesus is associated. All through this, you're going to notice the sun, moon, stars. Something happens with the sun, moon, stars, and the heavens or the constellations. And there should be signs. Now, that's not go, that's not stop, that's not yield, that's not one way. In other words, there's going to be something going on up in the heavens. What that just said was there's 3 levels. The moon is on one level. The sun is further out. And then even further out than the sun is the stars. So these are signs in 3 levels. How many levels of heaven are there? I saw a man about 14 years ago, whether in the body or out of the body, I cannot tell. Such a man was caught up into the, is there a level of the sun, and then yet a level further out the stars? So we are talking about something not just that's affecting the moon. We're talking about, brothers and sisters, something that's affecting the stars. So this is not something local. There should be signs in the sun and in the stars, and what is happening on the earth? Distress of nations, because everything's going topsy-turvy. This is very near the end of the 7-year tribulation. It says distress of nations with perplexity. Means there's no answer, there's no solution. The mankind that cannot change it. They cannot fix it. They can't send some spaceship out to drill a hole in it, to put a nuclear weapon so that they can blow up the thing and fix it. They can't fix it. There's perplexity. It's out of their control because God is getting the attention. The sea and the waves roaring. What did we just see this past December 26th of 2004? The sea and the waves roaring. Some 155,000 people killed all in an instant. When the tsunami came in and hit all of those, it's coming to all the godless people. Men's hearts failing them for fear. Do you think some hearts were failing them for fear? Well, we saw on TV recently, I remember one of the shots I saw, people were standing there like this in the beach. And they were watching this big tsunami come in. They were thinking, well, what in the world is it that is? There was one guy that said, well, there was a little bitty wave, and then there was another little bitty wave. And he said, then it went back out. I got my camera. I went down there. I was going to take some pictures. And then all of a sudden, whoosh, here comes this 20-foot wave and washes some places as much as 6 kilometers inland. And it washed in, grabbed everything, people, buildings, boards, cars, buses, and then pulled them and said that it went way out. You could see way down into the ocean because the whole earth was wobbling. And it says in there that it moved some of the islands as much as 25. It said that it actually made the earth, that the earth actually wobbled. It said that it moved the North Pole, the breaking of the water. We'll get into that in just a minute. Men's hearts failing them for fear and for looking after those things which are coming upon the earth. Now, why is God doing this? Men's hearts failing them for fear for looking after those things which are coming upon the earth, for the powers of heaven. And then shall they see the Son of Man coming in the cloud with power and great glory. And when these things begin to come to pass, and I believe that just happened, when these things begin to come to pass, draweth nigh. In other words, soon Jesus is coming. I believe that there's a strong possibility that what just happened, a picture of a woman having a child. In here that Sunday right after that, I was preaching on this, and right in front of our congregation. 1 Thessalonians 5:3 says, for when they shall say peace and safety, sudden destruction shall come upon them as travail upon a woman with child. Travail upon a woman with a woman with child. Now, to the congregation I said, and what is that event that begins the woman's travail? I said, well, pains, some said contractions. And then my wife said, you can have pains before? Have we had pains before? Yes, we've had. You can have contractions before? Had Oklahoma City, we've had Waco, we've had 9/11. We've had contractions before. We've had pains before. It's when the water breaks. Things that we've never seen in our lifetimes before, never in recorded history. We're going to start seeing those kind of things come to pass, if that was the water breaking. And the easiest of the contractions take place when the woman's labor. I said, ladies, help me out. And do they get her and closer as it's time for the birth? I said, I believe what that tsunami, 2004, is saying, because Jesus, and this is not from somebody calculating it out, saying Jesus is coming. This is not from some intellect. This is God saying, I am sending my son soon. Now, here's the next question. Gestation? Well, about 9 months. Isaiah 24 says, behold, the Lord maketh the earth empty. Matthew 24 says that unless Jesus returns, why is he going to kill off millions and millions of people when the wayward prodigal son interested in going back home to the father? That he started realizing he needed his father. And that's what God is doing. He is laying stripes upon the back of the sinners. And maketh it waste, sit upside down, and scattereth abroad the inhabitants thereof. Real interesting how God has supernaturally, I believe, shown me a couple of things on TV. I saw a special, something like the Discovery Channel or something like that. And they were in Hawaii, where there's active volcanoes right now. And that lava is bubbling out of those volcanoes right now. And they said that when it bubbles out, and they solidify, and they're aimed that direction. In other words, probably what happened in the flood is the North Pole was the South Pole, North Pole, vice versa. And what the Bible says is they're going to do this. Again, that's what it's saying. Put it upside down and scattereth abroad the inhabitants thereof. And it shall be as with the people, as with the maid, so with her mistress. As with the lender, so with the borrower. As the taker of usury, one with the giver of usury. Every person on earth is going to go through this labor of pain, thus saith the Lord. There is no pre-trib rapture that's going to get you out of it. You will, as they return the wayward child, back to the prodigal father. All people go through this. The land shall be utterly emptied, utterly spoiled, for the Lord hath spoken his word. See, this world, this earth that we have right now, that is all messed up, all full of sin. I mean, look at our bodies. We can barely live 70 years. These bodies were originally designed to live forever. We have pain in childbirth. We have to till the soil. It's not bad news, it's good news, but it's going through some trouble because we have to learn not to sin. The word languisheth and fadeth away. The haughty people of the earth do languish. Defiled unto the inhabitants thereof, because they have transgressed. Here it is. Changed the ordinance. Curse devoured the earth, and they that dwell therein are desolate. Therefore the inhabitants of the earth are burned. How can you burn everybody on earth? How in the world can you burn? Well, the Bible says that horrible malignant sores will break out on people towards the end of the tribulation. They're burned. Few men left. The city of confusion. That's why God calls us Babylon, because we opened our borders to all kinds of other gods. And in the president's inauguration speech, he mentioned the Quran. Open, equal. You see, they want all gods to be equal. All pathways to God. No. City council, and I said here in town, they were thinking about coming up and passing a law that you cannot discriminate against gays and homosexuals. And I went down among many of the other, matter of fact, there's 125 people signed up, and I was number 62. I said several things, but one of the things I said was, you know, you can go to Saudi Arabia, and I said, I can tell you churches are almost non-existent. There's probably less than in the whole nation. So I only knew of one, and I believe that's one of the most populated cities of the entire world, in Tokyo. I would say this, and this is what I said to him. I said, so if you want to be a Buddhist, if you want to be a Muslim, move to Saudi Arabia. If you want to be a Christian, but if you want to be a Sodomite, don't make this nation. Oh, how I wish I could have been there the day that they were writing the Declaration of Independence. Changed had I said, boys. Verse 20, Isaiah 24:10. The city of confusion, that's America. We're all confused about who is God. It's broken down. Every house is shut up. Why are they shutting up the houses? Are falling. I believe that there's all kinds of cataclysms and people are hiding. Every house is shut up that no man may come in. It shall be in the midst of the land among the people. There shall be as the shaking of an olive tree. Okay, what do? I mean, they have big machines now that go up and grab these trees by the trunk and shake them like that. Shaking of an olive tree. And as the gleaning of grapes, when the vintage is done, you see, God is telling us what he's doing. He's getting the fruit to fall off of the tree. And see, that's what he's doing. He's shaking the world. That he who fleeth from the noise of the fear shall fall into the pit. In other words, there's not going to be any way physically in the natural you're going to be able to protect yourself. But up out of the midst of the pit shall be taken in the snare, for the windows of heaven are open. This is going to be a time of supernatural things going on. A time when all kinds of miracles and signs and wonders take place. When he answers a prayer before we even get done saying it. We don't even get to the period at the end of the sentence before we see the prayer coming to pass. Because it is a great end-time battle of strength about who is God. Who is God? Satan? That's what it's really all about. And yes, we're going to see Satan and his man, the Antichrist, be able to call down fire out of the heaven. But see, God hadn't told you what he's doing. He's going to show his might. And it's, behold, I shall cause them to know my might, and they shall know that my name is... The foundations of the earth do shake. Isaiah 24:19. The earth is utterly broken down. The earth is clean dissolved. The earth is moved exceedingly. It is going to be a great shaking. There's not going to be anybody in town that is not going to be a part of this. The earth shall reel to and fro like a drunkard, and shall be removed like a cottage. Now that word like a cottage means it's going to be wobbling all over. I mean, we're going to see tsunamis like you can't believe. The sun going out, getting 7 times hotter and then going out. Everybody is going to be a part. And the transgression thereof shall be heavy upon it, and not rise again. In other words, this will fall, and it will not rise again. Then he will make a new heaven. It will come to pass that day that the Lord shall punish the host of the high ones that are on high. In other words, the leaders of the New World Order, the leaders that have corrupted and destroyed the earth. As Henry Groover was shown one of his visions. Gather sinners into cities marked for destruction. To supernaturally gather, he gathers the sinners for protection, he gathers the wheat or the righteous into cities marked for protection. He's going to gather the sinners into the pit. I remember when I was, March of 1988, when I was driving Dimitri Duduman and his grandson and interpreter Michael Boldea around. For 2 weeks I drove him around where he spoke and gave his testimony, and I told him the name, it's Kaw River, Missouri River, whatever river it was. We'd look at the sign. Sometimes we had even turn around, look at the sign back behind us, see the name of the river. And after a couple of days of this, finally I said, why do you ask the name of the river every time we pass it?
Thank you, Pastor. What an introduction. Well, let's go back to the beginning, at least the beginning of my, what we now call Planet X. Spring of 2002, I had two individuals, a couple of friends of mine, approach me. My friend Tom, who's a pilot and an aircraft mechanic. My friend Ron, who's a veteran of the peacetime army in Germany during the 1960s. Both these men are independent researchers, and they started telling me about Planet X and this book titled Blindsided by Mark Hazelwood. Mark did something that most authors won't do. He put evidence in the book that conflicts with his own value system. Most New Age authors, for example, won't have anything to do with the Bible, and most Bible scholars won't have anything to do with New Age information. But Mark Hazelwood included both, including historical evidence, archaeological evidence, fossilized evidence, geological, astronomical, biblical, psychic evidence, and last but not least, a lady who claims to talk to aliens. Now, that was a bit too much for me. However, I read the book, and I know documentation when I see it. I know evidence when I see it. Now, for a homicide detective, evidence is something you can put a blue evidence label on, mark it, and hand it to the court clerk as evidence. And much of what he had in the book is good evidence, well documented, that you can go back and find the original source material. So despite the lady who claimed to talk to aliens, who, by the way, gave her a date of the closest passage, that date being June of 2003, I continued my research, and I went deeper and deeper into the topic of Planet X. You heard in the introduction, I've been looking at Planet X-related matters since 1980. I began an independent research project in 1980, not knowing until 1992, 93 actually, what it was really all about. Going back to 1979, I found myself single, free weekends, looking for a hobby. I'd been out of the Army for 9 or 10 years, and I decided to go back in the Army Reserves as a Green Beret and let your tax dollars pay for my weekend fun. Seemed like a good deal to me. We spent a lot of our weekends in Special Forces training at a place called the Welding Springs Training Area, just west of St. Louis in St. Charles County. And along about 1980, the Department of Energy announced a Superfund cleanup project out there to clean up nuclear waste. Now, that was my first red flag because of the following. We guys in the Army knew that the military had been working with nuclear material out there for decades. So the men I worked with, on their own, without even telling the Army, they went to the trouble to get radiation detection equipment, and when we'd go out there training, they would routinely check out the training area to make sure there wasn't anything, because they didn't want to have kids with flippers instead of arms. It seemed like a good idea at the time. Point being, they never found any nuclear material. Barely anything above natural background radiation. Over the years, I watched this Department of Energy become a fairly good-sized project. They drug in the job trailers. They built about 15,000, 17,000 square feet of administrative buildings. Sometimes I would go by and photograph the names of the subcontractors at the front gate. At any government construction site, they always list the names of all the subcontractors at the front gate. One name happened to catch my eye one day, Worldwide Telecom. I didn't recognize that as a local business. So I submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to the Department of Energy, the contract specifications for Worldwide Telecom, along with 2 other requests for an engineering firm and a survey company. A few weeks later, I get a response back in the mail. The contract specs for the engineering company and the survey company, and a letter denying that Worldwide Telecom was even a subcontractor out there. And that kind of got my attention, so I went to a friend of mine who I thought might know who these people were. And he says, John, here's the deal. Now, this is in St. Louis. He says, so, first of all, they're headquartered in New Jersey. If you were going to build a brand new Pentagon, these are the people you would hire to put in the telecommunications. So that brought up even more questions. Under another Freedom of Information Act request, I asked how many phone lines they had out there at this construction site. The answer came back a couple of weeks later, 500 telephone lines. That sounded a bit large to me, so I talked to some contractor friends of mine, engineers who had spent 30 and 40 years in commercial construction, asking them what the largest number of phone lines they ever saw at the biggest construction site in their 40-year career of working commercial construction work, things like Boulder Dam and so forth. 50 phone lines at the largest construction site they ever saw in their 40-year career. Over the years, I interviewed different men who were working there, surveyors. I found out that everything was compartmentalized. They'd bring in one crew of surveyors to do a little section, another crew for over here from a different company, and a third and a fourth and so forth. Compartmentalized. I interviewed an engineer that worked out there, This was just fairly recently. And she was telling me, she's an electrical engineer, she couldn't understand the level of confidentiality and secrecy at a no-big-deal construction site. How there were certain areas that were completely off limits unless you had a certain pass and a certain badge. I talked to a man who was working on concrete out there. He said, John, I never in my career put titanium flakes in concrete before. So all in all, what we came to find out, looking at the infrastructure, the communications, the power that was going in there and still going in there, the water, fresh water, sewage treatment, and so forth, all this being underground, is that they were building a command and control center where hundreds of men and women, and their families if necessary, could live, work, play, have microwave pizza, and watch movies for years if they needed to. A very large, self-contained complex. I knew that quite a long time ago, but I couldn't make the connection. It appeared to be very military on one hand, but it wasn't the military. So it was kind of a big question mark. What I did come to learn, however, is that Superfund cleanup projects amount to a bottomless pit of unaccountable money. There's very few people that understand the technology of cleaning up nuclear waste. Very few. And even less understand how much it costs or how long it takes. The attitude of the congressman appropriating the money is, how much money do you need? Do you need another 10 million? How long will it take? Take as long as it takes. We want this stuff out of here. No matter how much it costs or how much it takes, we will give you as much money as you need. That's the attitude of the public and Congress when it comes to cleaning up nuclear waste. And that's what they did out there, was spend millions and millions of dollars. We have any veterans of the U.S. Navy in here? Well, the military in general is a subculture of our American culture. And of course, the Navy is a subculture. However, there's another subculture, and that's the U.S. Navy Submarine Corps. Now, every man who's ever set foot in a submarine as a crew member, whether he's the lowest ranking, least experienced, newest guy on the ship, has the IQ to be an officer. It's a very select group of men. That's not done in very many units. Special Forces happens to be another one. I happen to know two men who served with the United States Submarine Corps, one of them since 1979. I was having lunch with him last summer. I was telling him about Planet X, and he's telling me about the Ross Ice Shelf, ROSS, the Ross Ice Shelf in the Antarctic. And he's telling me about a physics class, a classified physics class taught by a Navy officer over 20 years ago. The Navy officer is now an admiral. What the U.S. Navy was telling the Submarine Corps more than 20 years ago is what will happen when the Ross Ice Shelf and the rest of the ice at the Antarctic melts. That the ocean levels will rise 14 to 32 feet. And it won't be like a bathtub filling with water. There'll be violent storms accompanying the rising ocean levels. I was telling him about Planet X, as I mentioned, and it wasn't until the next day that I realized we were both talking about the same thing. That he was talking about an effect, and I was talking about a cause. There has to be a trigger to cause this ice to melt. And I believe now we know what that trigger is. More recently, I recalled a map that a patient of my wife had showed me, going back 14 years or so. My wife, a chiropractor, has a lot of patients. One of them brought in this map that was prepared by Gordon Michael Scallion, a map that was alleged to be what North America looks like after these waters come up and land has raised and land has sunk beneath the ocean. At the time, I looked at this map and I thought to myself, this is a very nice, full-color fantasy, and this lady needs a tinfoil hat real bad. That was my thought. I didn't have anything else to correlate it to. More recently, however, I remembered this map and I looked it up on